Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on which part of the world you are. I am here in Sydney, Australia, and welcome to the channel. Now, today I'll be talking about one of the most neglected issues of our time, and sadly, it is the genocide of the Hindus in Hindustan. Now, why am I saying that this is one of the most neglected issues? Now, if you look at historical atrocities, right, some of the examples that will come to your mind is, say, for instance, the Second World War or the horrors of communism by people like, say, Mao Zedong or Stalin, the gulags, or even the Russian Civil War, right? Or if you look further back into the history, the colonization of essentially the entire world by the Europeans, the annihilation of the Native American Indians, or the transatlantic slave trade. So these are some of the examples that will come to your mind if you have to talk about historical atrocities, or even the most recent history of the invasion of the Arab nations by the US and its allies. So these cases you will see being talked about, being discussed, being publicized over and over by the media, by the politicians, essentially the faces of the media, the so-called VIPs, the so-called moderates, the flag bearer of humanity. They will bring up some of these cases straight away. But in its scale and intensity, when it comes to the devastation, in its scale, in its magnitude, in its intensity, the destruction of the native culture of India, the massacre of the people, is probably 5 to 6 times when it is compared to one of these examples, the examples that I just talked about. However, this case, this example is not given when it comes to its coverage, is probably not given 1/10 of importance, 1/10 of its significance. I'm talking about the genocide of the Hindus. And again, some of the details of this destruction, of this cultural devastation, has been brushed under the carpet deliberately, wishfully, by the so-called liberals, by the so-called flag bearers of humanity, by the so-called moderates. This is the most shocking part, right? Now, if you compare the numbers, why am I saying that this is 5 to 6 times more devastating? Right? Let me talk about the numbers. In Second World War, for instance, what 50 million people have reportedly lost their lives, have been killed. Now, in India, over 1,000 years, the destruction by the invaders and the colonizers, the destruction that has been perpetrated is in hundreds of millions, right? If you take the ratio, the number of people living on earth today is probably 10 times more than what it was used to be about 1,000 years ago. The ratio of people is probably 10/1. But the shocking part is it's not given 1/10 of its significance, right? In one case, just to give you a couple of examples, in one fateful night, Timurleng, a barbarian who slaughtered 100,000 innocent civilians in Delhi. 100,000. And you know what he did? He raised victory towers, minarets of victory, by the decapitated heads, by the heads of the slain victims. Aurangzeb, who beheaded Tegh Bahadur, who boiled Tegh Bahadur, right? Or like some historians estimate that there were 40,000 temples have been destroyed. 40,000 temples have been vandalized, have been destroyed. Their idols were put at the front so that it can be trampled by the so-called peaceful people, by the so-called pilgrims. The destruction, the hate, the heinous nature, the sadistic nature of this destruction, they used to put the idols, the destroyed idols, in the front so that it can be trampled day and night. So one historian, an American historian, summarized these destruction probably in the most famous line, probably in a most famous line. He said this, that the Muhammadan conquest of India is probably the bloodiest in human history. Not just the history of Bharat, not just the history of India. He claimed that this story is probably the bloodiest of entire human history. This is how much emphasis he put as a historian. But if you look at the mainstream narrative, if you look at the journalists, the so-called politicians, the faces of the media, this story, this sad story is never ever given even a scent of what it is the case for, let's say, the Arab invasion by the US, the most recent history. And this is the most shocking part. So Sadhguru made a very interesting comment recently, right? He said this when he was talking about the atrocities, the genocide of the Kashmiri Hindus. Now Kashmir, it's named after, this valley is named after Rishi Kashyap. If you are familiar with the history of India, is one of the ancient Indian sages. So he was talking about the genocide of these native people, the inhabitants of the land of Rishi Kashyap, the Pandits. He said this, that there is religious bigotry written into the scripture. And if we don't bring back that narrative, if we don't say that this is the narrative, that the religious bigotry written into the scripture, if we don't bring this narrative everywhere, if we don't say that this is the narrative that needs to be changed, then changing one thing or the other is not going to do anything. So the purpose of making video is to bring forth some of the most crucial details of history, some of the most painful details of history that has been brushed aside. Like, let me give you one example. When bin Qasim in 711, when bin Qasim, another barbarian, when bin Qasim came to the port city of Devil, he slaughtered men, women and children for 3 consecutive days. Right? I talked about Aurangzeb, Bakhtiyar Khilji, right? Another barbarian. There are 11 libraries have been burned in the land of knowledge in Bharat. So when this barbarian Bakhtiyar Khilji burned the library of Nalanda, it was said that the manuscripts, the books, were burned for 6 to 7 months. Thousands of temples have been destroyed. Millions of women have been taken to the Arab nations as sex slaves. There were like mountain range named after the slaughter of the Hindus, Hindu Kush. Mountain range was named after the slaughter, the atrocities committed against the Hindus. There was a minaret, I believe it's in Afghanistan or in Iran somewhere. There's a minaret, a landmark. It has a line. This is the line. That the daughters of Hindustan are being sold here for 2 dinar. Daughters of Hindustan, the women and children, who has been taken as sex slaves, who has been taken as war booty, again, so-called holy verses, the commandment of the God. And because of these so-called holy verses, women and children were taken as sex slaves, and they are being sold for 2 dinar. Landmark. So these are the atrocities committed by probably the most degenerate savages of human history. And again, our moderates, our so-called liberals, our so-called flag bearers of humanity will brush this detail under the carpet, will put aside this painful history for the sake of community cohesion. So this is the reason for making this video, to bring forth this kind of details to normal people, to everyday people, so that they become aware of what kind of atrocities, what kind of devastation religious bigotry can do to humanity. So I hope you enjoyed, and if this kind of material you like to see again, please subscribe and share it with your friends and family. If you like this, give it a thumbs up, and thank you for listening, and I will catch up with you on the next one. Bye for now.